All right, well, welcome to our faculty hiring training today. Thank you for being here. I want to introduce our presenter, Lisa Harris. She is from Shepherd Mullen, and she will be presenting our training for today, at least the morning, and then later on this afternoon, Luke Laura will also be doing some presenting here as well. So, Lisa, I will turn this over to you. Thank you.
So, hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with me, and I'm going to thank you in advance for your cooperation and participation and your attention. Right, I have 2.5 hours. I know that that is a long time. We will take a small break in between there. We'll also have some breakout sessions. Hopefully, this will be an interactive dialogue and not just me speaking at you all for 2 hours or 2.5 hours, because I know many of you have probably done these sessions before. And so before we get started, I'd like to get to know a little bit about you. So how many of you have done this session at least once before? How many have done it at least 5 times before? I'm sorry to you all that have done it many times. Of course, those of you who have done it more than 5 times know that you're here because this is an annual training that is required under the state requirements, and so here we are again. I also, in addition to these types of trainings, do the harassment prevention trainings that you have to do every 2 years, so I understand the repetitive nature of these trainings. My goal is for you all to walk away from at least one thing new, at least one thing that you hadn't really considered or thought about before, because every time you do one of these sessions, you hear some things that maybe you didn't hear the time before, because we're in and out. I don't think any of us ever hear everything that is said in a session that's this long. And so hopefully you'll walk away from here feeling like these 2.5 hours were a worthwhile use of your time. So what is your role? You're all here because you're part of the faculty hiring committee. You are the people who are going to be tasked with identifying and interviewing candidates and ensuring that the college does so in a fair and equitable way. That is a critical role, because the people that you interview, the people that you hire, are then going to be the people that interact with your students, who really prepare the next generation of teachers and professionals and leaders. And so it's really important that you appreciate what your role is, that you take that role very seriously, and that you do it in the most committed way possible so that we're getting the best outcomes that we can possibly get, and ultimately having the best faculty for our student body and for those people who are coming to our community college so that they can prepare themselves for the world. Right? So can we all commit to that? Great. So why are we here? Other than the annual requirement, can someone tell me why you all are here? No one knows why you're here? Best practices, that is true. So one of the things we want to get out of this is best practices, so that you walk away understanding what the expectations are of you as a member of the hiring committee. And for those of you who are here for your first time, hopefully you will take a lot from it. From those of you who are here for your 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th time, hopefully you'll at least take this refresher for what it is and be able to build on the knowledge that you already have. So I like to start with the college's commitment statement. Right? This is something that was included in the information that Charlie sent to me, because this is what you all have committed to as being part of Mira Costa College. And I've bolded some points that are important, right? So we are committed to creating a racially just campus climate. That means that as part of our job, we need to ensure that we are not treating anyone any differently because of their background, whether that's racial, ethnic, gender, or any other characteristic that they may have. We're also committed to continuing to serve all constituents with values rooted in equity, diversity, inclusion, and community. And I want to take a moment to talk about diversity, because over the years that I've been practicing, what I've found is that the word diversity has been erroneously equated with underrepresented, minority, or other group. But that's not what diversity is. Diversity includes every single one of us, because we're all different in some ways or another, whether it be the neighborhoods we grew up in, our racial or ethnic backgrounds, our socioeconomic status, our religion, whatever the case may be, every aspect of who we are contributes to the diversity of the college. And so it's not just about picking someone of a different race or picking someone of a different age group or picking someone of a different sex. It's about really having the diversity of thought, the diversity of experience. Because if you got 10 people from an underrepresented group, but they all went to the exact same school, they all lived in the exact same neighborhood, and they all had all the different same activities, you'd still not have the diversity that we are trying to achieve as an organization to make sure all of our students feel like this is a place where they belong and where they're welcomed, and that the faculty that you're interviewing and hiring feel like this is an inclusive workplace. So it means recognizing that we're not talking about just the visible differences, but also the invisible differences. Sometimes when I do these sessions, I like to show a diagram of an iceberg, because at the top are the things we see, right? I stand here today, you see potentially a black woman in her late 30s, early 40s, maybe, I'm maybe being generous to myself, who knows? But, right, exactly, right? Like 20, thank you, I appreciate that. But those are just the immediate things you see. What you don't know is that I'm an Afro-Latina, and that is a contributing factor that has influenced who I am and who I stand here today. What you don't know is that my family is military, and I was a military brat, so I moved around to all of these places. Those are the things that you learn by actually interacting with people, and you can't get to that point if you don't have that inclusive environment, both on your campus and in the hiring process, in the recruiting process, in the interviewing process. And then I also want to note that inclusion goes beyond that. So inclusion goes beyond recognizing and appreciating and valuing all of our differences and everything that we bring to the table, and it goes to making people feel actually welcomed despite those differences, but despite those experiences. And so, there's this old adage that goes, diversity is being brought to the party, and inclusion is being invited to dance, right? Because we all actually want to be a part of it, not just sitting on the outside looking in. And then that equity piece is about recognizing that we're not all starting in the same place. And so when we think about equitable outcomes, sometimes that means different things for different people, because the starting line is not the same for everyone. I'm not talking about preferences, I'm not talking about discriminatory decisions, I'm talking about ensuring equitable access to everyone regardless of where their starting point was. And so that other aspect that we have in our commitments, in our EEO plans and throughout the college's documentation, is the connection between workforce diversification and the college's educational goals and mission, and how significant that is. So we as an institution have recognized that there is a connection between those things. And that's another one of the reasons why it's important that you all are here and understand what the expectations of you are in the hiring process, because the decisions you make will also impact your student body. And then one more set of commitments that I want to highlight are your commitments to diversity in hiring that are also in your EEO plan and in the college's documentation. And the commitment that you all have made, that the Board of Trustees has made, is to promote the total realization of equal employment through a continuing equal employment opportunity program. So you all have a plan. Hopefully you all have read the plan at some point or another. If you haven't read it in the last year, I encourage you to read it as you embark on this next level, this next year of faculty recruiting and hiring. And then we've also recognized that diversity in the academic environment fosters cultural awareness, promotes mutual understanding and respect, enhances student learning, and provides suitable role models for all of our students. So those are the benefits we've chosen to highlight, and we'll talk about later as we go through the session other educational benefits that come from diversity in hiring, that come from us doing that job effectively and really validly and giving value to every candidate who comes through the interviewing process. And then, of course, I'm a lawyer, so I can't go on without talking about the legal exposure. So if all of the things that I just said weren't enough for you to do the right thing, then let's talk about the law. Because hiring decisions can be the basis for costly and time-consuming lawsuits. So another question for the audience: how many of you have been deposed? So everyone else, no, your hand up one more time. Everyone else talk to these people. It's not fun to be deposed. It's not an enjoyable experience. It takes time away from your actual objectives and the things that you need to do related to your job. And so I don't want any of you all to be in the position where you're being deposed or sitting in a trial because of decisions that you made throughout this process. And so part of this is about protecting you all, each and every one of you, from the legal exposure that comes from discrimination in hiring, or the perception of discrimination in hiring. Because we know that the perception can be enough for someone to go and file a lawsuit. And once we're in that place, once we're down that path, then we're going through the discovery, we're doing the depositions, and even if in the end, a jury, a judge, an arbitrator finds that you did not engage in discriminatory behavior, that's 1, 2, potentially 3 years of your life that has been invested in this process. And so the goal is to avoid that altogether. So you should treat the recruiting process, the interviewing, the hiring process, as though there will be a third party reviewing that. So it's going to be your internal lawyers looking at that. It's going to be an arbitrator looking at that. It's going to be a judge or a jury. You want to be able to say with confidence that the decision that you made, that the recommendation that you made was based on legitimate, non-discriminatory reasons, that was based on reasons that were related to the job that you were interviewing and hiring for, that you did not allow your unconscious bias to impact the decision-making when considering a candidate, and that you considered the facts that were actually available to you that were within the legal bounds of the law when making your decision about who to hire and who to extend an offer to and who to recommend. So what are we going to talk about today? I've already done a lot of talking, right? Put the agenda on like slide 7. But so we're going to talk about the federal and state non-discrimination laws. There are lots of them. We all have to comply with them, so we're going to spend some time there. We're then going to talk about the state EEO laws that promote inclusion, right? Because there is a balancing act. On the one side, there are laws that say we cannot discriminate against people based on their protected characteristics. We also have Prop 209 that says we can't give them preferential treatment based on their protected characteristics. But we also need to achieve a diverse and inclusive work environment. We also need to achieve a diverse and inclusive candidate pool. And so there is tension sometimes between those two things. There's tension between the laws against discrimination, against preference, and our understanding and recognition that we talked about already that diversity is important, that diversity is critical to our faculty, because it's critical to our student body, because it's critical to our community. And so the goal is to achieve that diversity without running afoul of the discrimination laws and the other prohibitions that we legally have. So then we'll talk about the educational benefits of workforce diversity. By now, hopefully you all know those, right? You're experiencing them yourselves day to day, but that's a requirement of this training, so we are gonna spend some time on it. And then we're gonna talk about elimination of bias in hiring decisions and some common biases that come up in hiring decisions and that you wanna try to avoid. Best practices for selection and screening committees, and then your EEO plan. We have some information in here on your EEO plan. I, again, encourage you all to go read your EEO plan, but we'll spend some time highlighting some key points off of that. And as we go through, Charlie may chime in here as well. And please do feel free to ask questions all throughout. You know, there is a questions slide at the end, but if you wait until that last slide, I have failed. So please do ask questions and chime in. So I just want to start with a little bit of background, right, of where we are in the laws, what the progression of all of this has been. Because there has been a drive and a desire to create equity and diversity amongst faculty and workplaces for a long time. That has always existed. It's existed for at least a few decades. And then there have also been some pushback against those efforts in those decades as well. And so the law has had this progression over time on what is permissible and what's not permissible. And so we know that in 1996, Prop 209 was passed. It really put a lot of limitations on what we could consider and how we approach potential preferences for candidates, for students, things of that nature. In 2023, we saw the Supreme Court make a decision based on the SFFA decision, affirmative action in colleges. Now, while that decision doesn't necessarily affect employment decisions in the same way as it affects student admission, it really was the nation catching up to where California has been for some time now. And so there's still this sentiment against, and this pushback against equity and diversity efforts. And in fact, if you read some of the articles out there right now, you'll find that diversity is a bad word, that ESG is a bad word, because there's this push not against, in my view, it's not against what we're actually trying to achieve, it's against the idea of what we're trying to achieve. So there's this conflation of this perception that what we're doing is lowering standards, that what we're doing is trying to achieve goals, that what we're doing is trying to hit quotas. And that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is trying to increase access and open up opportunities to groups that may not have had that access and those opportunities historically. And there are lawful ways to do that, and that's some of what we will talk about today. So there are lots of different laws that are implicated that prevent discrimination. There's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which hopefully most of you all are familiar with. It's essentially the federal law that prohibits discrimination based on gender, based on race, based on sex, based on religion. I'm missing one, color, national origin. And then there's California's version, which is the Fair Employment and Housing Act, which is more expansive and includes all of the different protected characteristics. There's Title IX, which prohibits discrimination based on sex. There's the Americans with Disabilities Act, which not only prohibits discrimination based on a disability, but also creates an affirmative obligation for us to provide reasonable accommodations to applicants or to employees who might need that accommodation to perform the essential functions of their job. It's an important one to highlight here because one of the things that we have historically not focused on, in particular under the ADA, are neurodivergent candidates who might need accommodations through the process because of a mental disability or other mental health issue. And so as you have potential faculty candidates coming through, if someone discloses a need for an accommodation, based on a mental health disability, remember that we have that affirmative obligation to engage in the interactive process and to provide that. And so your HR team is here to support you through that process to the extent that a candidate raises an issue like that. Sometimes it might not come directly to HR. Sometimes it might come up in the interview itself. And you want to make sure that you are looping in your HR team and your legal support team to be able to help you through that process. Were you going to say something, Charlie?
I was going to ask if you could give an example, like a scenario where you're in a committee and someone says, "What?" And then you're like, "Oh."
Sure. So sometimes you might be sitting in a committee and maybe you ask them one of those behavioral questions and you say, you know, if you were in this scenario, what would you do? And that person says, due to my mental disability, I actually need additional time to think through that question, and I'd like to be able to provide a written response afterwards, right? That would be something completely different than what your usual process is. And that's, you know, providing questions in advance is an accommodation request that has come across my desk in many different instances. And how we resolve that has varied from employer to employer. In some instances, employers have pushed back and said, well, we use these same questions over and over again, and so we don't want them out on the internet somewhere where other candidates are going to receive them. But at the same time, if we have someone who is completely capable of being a thriving faculty member here at the community college who just needs that accommodation and connection with the interview process, that's something that we should be escalating so that the HR team can talk through and determine whether there is an accommodation that can be provided. And it may be that interview needs to be rescheduled for another time once an accommodation has been determined if one can be provided.
So in that example, let's say it's the third question that's asked and that happens. Then the chair would say, okay, we're going to basically hold the committee, they call HR, and then we would address that in however way we see fit. We may continue the interview, we may not. But the key is that feel comfortable stopping the interview, contacting HR, so then we can then help support that situation.
Absolutely. And what you'd want to say to the candidate so that it's not completely awkward, right? So what you'd say to the candidate is, thank you for sharing that information. You know, we are an equal opportunity employer. Our commitment is to provide accommodations where a reasonable accommodation can be provided. I need to take a moment to discuss this with our HR team to figure out what a possible reasonable accommodation might be. And then you pause the process, you go and you reach out to HR. Maybe they can get an answer to you right then and there, maybe not. And they might say, you know what? We need to do a little bit more digging into this, so please go back to the candidate and let them know that we are going to reschedule their interview for a later date. Either way, we want to make sure that we're recognizing our obligation to provide accommodations where one is needed and requested by a candidate, and we also want to be empathetic in that process and avoid being judgmental or getting irritated by the request that has been made. Because, you know, one of the things that I said in a session I did last night is that the world was not built for the neurodivergent. The world was built for extroverts who think in the normal course. So even introverted people sometimes face barriers through navigating the normal process. And so we want to be mindful that if someone does have a disability, that we would take that into account the same way we would any physical disability. And I find that physical disabilities are usually much easier. People see them, they recognize them, and they appreciate that they need to accommodate that. But mental health issues, mental disabilities are usually not viewed in the same way. There's a certain level of judgment that sometimes comes with mental health disabilities, and so we want to avoid that when we're going through the interview process. There's also the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which protects people who are 40 years old or older. I love the excitement for like half of the room in here. And then there's the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. All right, so now that we've all celebrated being over 40, like, which is the only moment that anyone does that, right? Like, this is the only moment. So the last law at the federal level is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which prohibits discrimination based on medical history, genetic information. You know, if you're in a space where you're implicating Gina, that's a problem already, right? So hopefully you're not requesting any medical information. You're not asking people, any applicants, about their family medical history. None of those things are relevant to your interviewing process, right? Wait, I have a comment over here that I do want to hear. Yeah, you, I heard you.
Well, no, I was just thinking, when I was hired, I had to pass the physical. So isn't that part of the GMAT?
So typically, that's a good question, right? That's why I chime into the chatter that people are doing on the sidebar.
I only say this because I left another job, came here, took the physical, and then they found out that I was exposed to TB. And for a brief time, I thought that I quit my other job and wasn't going to get hired again. Part of my friends were, oh shit, what do I do now?
So physical examinations are permitted. Actually, before I answer this question, Charlie, do you all still do physical exams?
Yes.
Okay. So physical exams are permitted when they are related to the job and the job requirements require you to be able to perform certain physical functions and activities. I will say, though, that that is not a process that will be discussed in any of your interviews, right? Like, that's a process that's going to be handled separately from the hiring committee and the interview process, and so that's not something that should be coming up in your conversations. So if you're having conversations in any of your interviews about someone's medical conditions or their family medical history, that's something that hopefully you will stop now and never do again, right? So here's the list of all the many protected characteristics. This slide just keeps getting denser and denser. And so I provide this list not for you to memorize all of these protected characteristics. There is no value in you memorizing all of these protected characteristics. I provide this list for you to appreciate how extensive the anti-discrimination laws are and all the things that they protect. But the goal here is not for you to memorize this list. The goal here is for you to recognize and appreciate that all of your decisions should be based on legitimate reasons related to the position that you're hiring for. If every decision that you make is based legitimately tied to the job qualifications, the actual job qualifications, not the preferred ones, but the actual job qualifications for a position, then you don't have to worry about all of these protected characteristics, because you'll be able to say with confidence that you didn't consider any of these things when you were interviewing this candidate. You didn't consider any of these things when you were making the recommendation. You didn't consider any of these things when you were making a decision. So essentially, the law prohibits employers from making any decisions about someone's terms and conditions of employment related or based on one of those protected characteristics. And there's a long list of what's considered a term and condition of employment, but at the top of the list are recruitment and hiring. And so I just emphasize that here, that these decisions are critical decisions. These are decisions that impact people's lives. And to your point, you had already quit your other job, so these are decisions that can impact long-term futures as well. And anytime there's someone who thought that they were going to get a job and then they don't get it, they're gonna spend lots of time thinking about the recruitment process and the hiring process and the conversations they had in their interviews and all of the questions that were asked of them, and the facial reactions of all of the people in the room when they responded to questions. And what you don't want them to come to at the end of all of that analysis is that it must have been based on one of those protected characteristics. What you want them to come to at the end of that analysis is that it was a fair process and that they were valued, they were considered. Ultimately, they didn't get the position, but you win some, you lose some. So diving a little bit deeper on what the law requires. Employers must treat all individuals equally by evaluating each person on the basis of their own individual skills, knowledge, and ability. Notice what's not on this list. Assumptions, perceptions, or deductions based on your assumptions or perceptions. It's based on actual individual skills, knowledge, and ability. And so when we're thinking about candidates, when we're going through this process, when we're deciding who's the best person for the position, we should be looking and considering their individual skills, their knowledge, their ability. That does include their experience. It does include how they've addressed issues in the past. It does include their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because those are qualities and qualifications that we are looking for in candidates. We want candidates who are going to be able to effectively work with and support our entire student body. And so those are legitimate factors related to a hiring position. What's not a legitimate factor are the assumptions that we might make based on someone's background, based on what their address is, based on what schools they went to, right? Like, we all have our own perceptions of what schools are better, what schools are worse. Sometimes people went to schools that were lower ranked, and I don't say worse, I say lower ranked, because of economic reasons. Because they got, I went to St. John's for law school, wasn't a top 25 law school, but I went there because I had a full ride. And so I came out with no debt. And there's value to that, right? There is value. And so I personally, when I'm interviewing candidates, I think that's probably smart decision making, right? So it's a question of what people did with that education. What did they go there and learn? What skills did they take away from the education that they obtained? Because someone can go to Harvard and fail. They won't let them. So they'll still get a degree. But they might not be invested. They might not have taken a lot away from the experience and really built on their skills and abilities. And someone could have gone to a lower ranked school and been at the top of their class and really learned a lot and taken away from it, and really have all those skills and attributes that you're looking for the position that you're trying to fill. And so we want to avoid the potential assumptions that we make, the biases that we might have based on what schools appear on someone's resumes or what locations they might have taught at before. We want to really think about what their skills, their knowledge, their ability is, what they did with those opportunities that they had, what that experience has given them, and how they convey their ability to do the best job for your students, which is ultimately what we're hiring for. And then employers must not treat individuals on the basis of the characteristics, biases that are often attributed to those in their protected classes. Yes?
I got a quick question on that situation that I've seen before. So not hiring in a language area, but candidates are multilingual. And I think working in a diverse environment, multilingual is almost always a positive. But sometimes when you bring that up, people see that as a proxy for just choosing them because of that background, instead of just valuing that ability to speak languages. How do you see that?
So when we're thinking about languages, we're always thinking about what benefit does it add. So for the position that we're hiring for today, let's say we're interviewing a candidate for a position, they are going to teach a class that historically the data has shown is primarily attended by people of different groups, different backgrounds. Some classes are more, like if you're in a certain department or certain majors are going to have a higher demographic of one group versus the other. If you're hiring in a major that has a higher demographic of Latinx individuals, for example, and so there is benefit to being able to speak the language and being able to communicate, then that's something you can consider. We're not saying we're looking for a Latinx hire. We're saying we're gonna give consideration to someone who has Spanish-speaking ability. What I do caution, right, is that when someone shows you or says that they're fluent in Spanish, they have it on their resume, maybe you have someone in the interview who asks them something in Spanish and they're able to coherently respond. Let's not delve into why they speak Spanish or how they speak Spanish or where they learned it, because then we start getting into information that is not relevant to the decision making. Because what's relevant to the decision making is whether or not they have that language ability, whatever the language may be.
Hey, can I ask a follow-up then?
Of course.
If the language issue is not mentioned in the job posting, we can still consider that? I mean, it sounds almost like we're making an extra requirement in our head that some people will happen to stumble upon, and others won't know that we were looking for that. And maybe they are fluent in the language, but it's not on the job posting, and so I see a potential problem there.
So what you're pointing to, which I like, thank you, is the consistency across considering applicants and considering criteria. And if you're going to consider language as a potential bonus for a position, then that's something you should ask every candidate that you interview for that position about. So I wouldn't just rely on what's on their resume. I would say, this department has a high population of Asian American descendants from China. Chinese would be a beneficial skill set for this role. Are you fluent in Chinese? Do you have language capabilities in Mandarin or in Cantonese? And you would ask every single candidate that. You wouldn't only ask the ones that appear to be of Asian descent.
But what if that was not on the job description? But that was just something, like, maybe said, okay, later on, this is a quality that you want. Is that permissible?
It is permissible for you to consider it. I don't think that these things usually become determinative factors in why you hire someone or not. Like usually it's gonna be a consideration in the conversation. And that's why you have an entire committee, because you're all gonna identify different aspects of the candidates that you interviewed based on the criteria and the job that you posted, and really talk through who's going to be the best potential candidate for the role that you're hiring for. Usually though, your job description in that situation is gonna say something like X language preferred. Not a requirement, right? So we're not excluding candidates who don't have that capability, but we are saying that we're gonna give additional consideration to candidates that do. Charlie, did you want to chime in?
And I would say, if language is important to you, you want to have that discussion up front, right? You don't want to do it on the fly. So everyone needs, if a specific language, what it is, not just, whatever, but just be intentional about it up front so that, and it is about that language, not a race or anything like that, but it's whatever that is, the committees have to agree so that when you're screening fairly around that particular criteria. So I just want to be sure that it's intentional and not happening on the fly.
And that goes to one of our best practices, right? Before you even bring candidates in, your committee should be talking through what you are looking for that role. What is needed for that role? What are the key criteria? What are the key attributes and skills that are going to help that role thrive? And that's helpful also because it'll allow you to vet out the things that aren't actually necessary for the role. So usually that dialogue, that conversation is not only going to help you think about the things that are beneficial and necessary for a role, but it's also going to help you weed out those things that we sometimes like to see, but are actually not necessary or relevant to a role, that can sometimes be barriers to different applicants and different candidates. And then, as I mentioned earlier, applicants who are not hired can file a claim for failure to hire for discriminatory reasons. And so these are critical decisions that you're making, which may be scrutinized by a third party. So now we flip to the other side, right? So we've gone through all of these laws that prevent discrimination. So we've talked about the laws that limit what we can do and what we can consider in our decisions. Now we're going to talk about the laws that want to promote that and help us achieve that goal of creating a diverse workforce, and diverse in the broader sense definition that I mentioned earlier, so that we can have a workforce that will be beneficial to our student body and that will help the college achieve its ultimate goals of being able to really have that inclusive environment. So there's the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972 at the federal level, right? Like, that's the law that led to every employer having that language in their job application that says we are an equal opportunity employer and we don't discriminate on the basis of any of these characteristics. You know, hopefully people stay true to that and not just post it, right? Because I've never seen a job description without it. It's always there. No matter how inclusive the employer actually is, the language is there. But we want to hold ourselves to those commitments, and we want candidates to walk away feeling like that was actually the case. There's the California Education Code, and then there's Title V as well, which is the law that really imposes your EEO plan requirements and things of that nature. So under the California Education Code, each district employer shall commit to sustained action to devise recruiting, training, and advancement opportunities that will result in equal employment opportunities. And that means equal employment opportunities for everyone, the entire breadth of candidates that might be out there. And so to the extent that someone meets the qualifications of a position, then they should have an equal opportunity and access to interview and potentially obtain that position. And then it also says that academic and administrative applicants must demonstrate sensitivity to and understanding of the diverse academic, socioeconomic, cultural, and ethnic backgrounds of community college students. I think we can all appreciate that the community colleges in particular generally have a more diverse population of students than, say, a four-year institution, and most definitely than the top 25 schools. And so it is even more critical for us to ensure that we're hiring faculty who can appreciate those differences and who are going to support every student who comes through their classroom, every student that they interact with through our college, and really see the potential of those students and help them thrive and achieve their ultimate goals, and that it's not someone who's going to have a bias against students of different backgrounds and potentially inhibit or hinder someone's ability to thrive. Because when a student is enrolling in community college, they're enrolling in an opportunity for self-betterment, for self-improvement. And we want to promote that. We want to support that. And then, as I mentioned, there's Title V, which is the multi-step process to promote diversity, including the EEO plan. And it also includes mandated training for hiring committees, as we all know as we sit in this room. I did want to highlight some of the recent changes under Title V. So in October 2022, so it's something that should have been touched on or would have been touched on during your training last year, just as it passed. but I want to take a moment to reiterate some of these points because they are still newer requirements. And as I was going through these changes, I felt like these were important ones really to highlight here. So job announcements must include, where applicable, the possibility of meeting minimum qualifications through equivalency, right? Keeping in mind that not everyone has the same access and opportunities coming up until this point. And so providing those alternative equivalencies to the extent that we can, that's a step towards equity, right? So that is a step towards creating equity, is by allowing those comparable, equivalent skills that someone might be able to have that would still qualify them to be able to successfully do the role that you're hiring for. And so while there might be a preference sometimes, so the easiest equivalent is GED versus high school diploma, ultimately the information that you need to learn to achieve both is the same. And so if you're hiring for a position that requires a high school diploma, and I know at the faculty level we're talking much higher, I'm just using this as an example, then you do want to identify where those equivalencies might exist. And so that is going to be true as well, one of those conversations that you want to have with your hiring committee when you're deciding what the criteria for the role is. So not just stopping at, well, this is the criteria that everyone else who has held this position has had, but taking that extra moment to say, are there equivalent skill sets, are there equivalent experiences that would parallel to this same criteria that would allow someone to successfully do this job? And doing that on the front end, so then you're applying that same criteria, those same equivalencies to every candidate who's coming through, to everyone who you're interviewing through that hiring process. Yes? It would be applicable to international applicants as well. This is probably more going to fall on the HR and the Charlie side, but you want to first screen all the initial applications to determine which candidates satisfy the job specifications, and then those are the people who will be part of your qualified pool of applicants. And once you've identified that qualified pool, then there's that extra step of having to do an initial demographic review of the qualified applicant pool before the applicant deadline for each position closes, and potentially extending that deadline if you're seeing that you aren't meeting the goals of your EEO plan in the qualified applicant pool that you have.
Can I, this may be to Charlie, what on the HR side happens before it comes to the committee? What will you be looking for that would deem someone not qualified to then make it to the?
So whatever the MQs are, that's who gets in, right? But then after that, if we see that a pool is not reflective of the goals that we're trying to accomplish, we have a law that allows us to hold that pool to do additional recruitments to further diversify that pool. So it doesn't necessarily mean we throw it out. We may extend it, we may throw it out, but we'll probably extend it, give more time, and try to do a little more focused outreach so that that diversity of that pool can then be what is closer to where our goals are, so then we can move on for that. And we've had a committee or two, not many, but we had a committee or two that we've had to hold because of that. But not, and to Lisa's point earlier about you have different demographics with students with different disciplines, or you do the same thing with faculty. There's a certain demographic with a particular, discipline where you see a different kind of demographic compared to a different discipline. And so we're aware of that. We see data that produces demographics by discipline to be sure that we're not missing something or over-judging or making assumptions about what that pool really should look like, because it really does matter by the discipline as well. So your physics, for example, is going to be quite different than your counselors, depending on what the issue is. So the point, though, is that if it looks like the pool is not diverse enough, we will hold that recruitment to diversify that pool, so then we can proceed after that.
There's a question here.
I guess what I think is a logistics question. So as a committee that's putting together a job announcement that might indicate obvious minimum qualifications and then make that acknowledgement that there might be those who need to apply for equivalency, as the discipline experts, I think most of us are pretty familiar with what kinds of things might suggest that a candidate needs equivalency. And I do know through the application process, there's a part that says if you believe you're a person who might need to apply for equivalency, there's like a process for that. But I do know that when you become a part of the hiring committee, you only have access to those applications which have been deemed by HR as having met the minimum qualifications. So how do committees communicate to HR the scenarios in which someone might be eligible for equivalency and maybe not know it? Does that make sense? I worry that maybe through the HR process, by no fault of their own, that there might be people who could have applied for equivalency and either didn't or didn't know that they should have because their qualifications were, I don't want to say obscure enough, but maybe diverse enough that it's not as obvious as it could be that that person could or should apply for equivalency. Does that make sense? Is that a fair question?
So if I understand it correctly, there's reason to believe that a candidate may be eligible for equivalency but is not brought into the pool.
Yeah.
Is that the,
They weren't aware that they needed to apply for it. They maybe thought that their qualifications were obvious and that HR screening was like, yeah, no. So like if a person doesn't meet minimum qualifications, they get an email from HR saying you didn't meet minimum qualifications.
Yeah, and I think even adding on to that question, it's more also, does HR have the information to assess the equivalencies when they're determining whether or not someone meets the minimum qualifications and to meet for the job?
So I think we've handled this in a couple different ways, and it sort of depends on the pool, number one. So if we have a really robust pool and a lot of people have followed our instructions and requested equivalency if they need to, sometimes we'll be a little less lenient about that, and people who didn't actually submit a request or acknowledgement that they need equivalency, they may be screened out, and that's based on having an already robust and diverse pool. Conversely, if we have a pool that is really small or maybe not so diverse, we're definitely more conscientious about that. And so if people maybe didn't request equivalency in their application, but we see that it's reasonable that they maybe didn't realize they needed to request equivalency, in those cases, we will forward them on to the committee. And we always err on being inclusive. If we feel like we're not the experts on the minimum quals, we've definitely connected with the discipline experts to have a look if an equivalency request is reasonable. So it's really a partnership, and I think we err on being inclusive at all times.
Great. Does that answer the question? Great. Well, I think the other thing that I will add to it, right, because to the points that were made in the response, the discipline probably has more information about what the equivalencies are. And so ensuring that you're conveying that information to HR will help them through that process as well, so that as they're going through and determining whether someone meets the minimum qualifications and reviewing those equivalency requests, they can make at least a partial initial assessment as to whether or not those equivalencies are being met. And so it's more of an open line of communication. And I'm all for over-communicating with HR, because the more information that they have, the more informed their decisions can be as well. Yes.
If the committee chair, could the committee chair come to HR and say, hey, if you're going to not approve someone because the degree doesn't match, could you check with us first so that we could review it as the discipline expert? Just in case there is.
Now I might be
I think
creating
it might
more
go back
work for
to
HR.
depend, but
I think it does depend. I mean, if that's a concern, please communicate that with us, and we'll definitely partner with you as much as we reasonably can. Again, if we're talking about a really large pool of diverse candidates in the hundreds, that might not be reasonable or possible, but let's just communicate openly about that, and we can let you know what the pool size is looking like. So I think, again, it's just that open communication, and we're happy, I think, to do that, speaking for the HR team.
Thank you. So some other changes is that individuals from different gender identities are now included as one of the categories who should be present and respectfully treated for diversity. This is an important point because what we're seeing as time passes is an increase identification as non-binary, as gender non-conforming, as trans. And that is something that we're likely to see a continuous increase as time passes, as society becomes a little bit more accepting of people's actual identifications and their own personal gender identities. And so to see this change is something that I thought worth highlighting because this is a social change that we're also seeing as a society, and it's a change that we're gonna see in our students, and it's a change we're gonna see in our faculty who are applying for positions as well. Reliance on preferred job qualifications that do not reasonably predict job performance is now explicitly stated as an example of a barrier to equal employment opportunities. And so really taking that time to understand what is actually necessary for the job and doing that review on the front end as a committee is one of those best practices for removing potential systemic barriers to equal employment opportunities. And then for the job announcements themselves, updating the job announcements to reflect accurately the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities of the position, including a commitment to equity, which I think generally we see in postings, but really ensuring that we're displaying that commitment. And then EEO programs should be informed by the district's longitudinal workforce and applicant analyses. And Charlie mentioned earlier that that is something that they look at and they review when they're looking at the diversity of the pool. So just some principles to think about of lawful equal employment opportunity hiring. The protected status of a candidate is never a factor. For better or worse, it should never be a factor. So we can't give preferential treatment, we also can't give negative treatment. But it shouldn't be a factor because what we're looking for are the specific job-related skills, knowledge, attributes, and those are the factors that we should be focusing on. Infusing a commitment to diversity into the hiring process, however, does not involve lowering standards. We're not looking for people who aren't qualified. We're not looking for people who are unable to do the job. And the myth out there that there aren't qualified candidates who are minorities, who are in underrepresented groups, is just that. And so we don't need to lower our qualifications to have equal employment opportunities and to increase the diversity in our workforce. Infusing a commitment to diversity into the hiring process does involve assessing candidates against job-related criteria that includes eliminating sort of the unnecessary, not job-related factors, and also expanding and updating what we consider to be job-related. Most of the times, people determine the skills that are needed for a job by the incumbent in that role. If the incumbent in that role is of a particular background, of a particular experience, of a particular group, we may be building in some biases when we create the criteria. And if the workforce that we have, if the faculty that we currently have is not as diverse as we are trying to achieve, but we determine the criteria for who we hire based on the faculty that we have, then we're never gonna increase the diversity of our faculty. And so we really need to spend the time thinking not only about who has succeeded in the role, but what are the actual skills needed for that role? And making sure that we're considering all of the candidates who have those skills, not just the ones that have the skills of the current successful candidate or the current incumbent. So now we're gonna turn to educational benefits of workforce diversity. But it's 10 o'clock and I've been talking for an hour, so I'm gonna give everyone 5 minutes to stand up and stretch, and then we'll come back to this next segment. So we're going to go through just a few true or false on how diversity potentially impacts our students. So the more diverse the faculty, the greater diversity of course content and readings, curricular and teaching methods, and scholarly ideas presented to students. True or false? True. And why is that important? Anyone know? Like, wait, you all said true, but you're like, oh yeah, that's true, but who cares, right? Like, why is it valuable that we have greater diversity of course content and readings, curricular, and teaching methods? That's exactly right. Because not everyone connects to material in the exact same way. So the more diverse our curriculum, the more diverse our teachings, the more likely that we are to touch at least one student for these different things that we're touching on in our courses. And ultimately, we exist as a college, as a community college for our students. And so if we're not reaching them, if our faculty is not effectively teaching to them, then we are not doing our jobs. And so when you're hiring, we're looking for candidates that are going to be able to do that are going to be able to connect. Cooperative learning has demonstrated value in enhancing the academic achievement of students from all racial, ethnic groups, and in reducing prejudice as students improve their interaction skills with students from different backgrounds. True or false? And why does it matter? That's exactly right. We're preparing our students for the world. And the world is filled with a lot of different people. And so them being able to build the skills now where they can interact with each other, build interpersonal relationships across differences with different groups has value to their ultimate success and hopefully keeps them out of trainings with me for not being able to interact in a way that's legally compliant when they get into the real world. Having diverse faculty and employees fosters a sense of belonging for faculty of color. True or false? And why? Why does it matter? Have you ever been the only person in a room? The only person of your background in a room? How does that feel? Do you feel like you belong there? Do you feel like your voice is valued? Maybe that starts to contribute to you developing imposter syndrome and thinking that you're there by fluke. Right? And so as you have a more diverse faculty, it does create a greater sense of belonging from all the people in the faculty who have these different backgrounds. It's hard to be the only in a room. And so while that's not going to lead to us making decisions that impact or that take into account race or ethnicity or any of those things, we do know that that's a benefit to having a more diverse faculty, is that it's going to lead to better retention. It's going to lead to better senses of belonging and inclusion. And then having diverse faculty and employees impacts retention of minoritized candidates. True. Right? As I just said, ultimately, retention can be impacted by whether or not people feel like they belong and whether or not they feel like they can thrive in an environment. And when someone is the only one, it is hard to feel like you belong and that you're included. So some benefits for the community at large is that it improves equity in student outcomes. There are studies that show that it does impact the equity gap by up to like 50% or so to have more diverse faculty. It increases quality of instruction because we get that diversity of instruction and perspective, and it limits potential liability from claims of discriminatory hiring practices. Because if you have someone interviewing with you and they look at your faculty and no one in your faculty looks like them, they might think that you didn't hire them for a reason that's based on them not looking like everyone else. I also want to emphasize, though, that the converse can be true too. So we see more what we colloquially call reverse discrimination claims now than we ever have historically. And so that goes back to the point that I was making earlier about how diversity isn't equivalent to minority. It's not equivalent to underrepresented. It's actually all of the other factors. So the straight white male can also bring a claim for race discrimination if they believe that they weren't hired because they're a straight white male. And so while I understand the intent and the objective of wanting to create a diverse faculty, that doesn't mean non-white faculty. And so it's just as bad to say, oh, we want to hire a brown person for this, as it is to say we want to hire a white person for this. Because it may be that you undermine the objectives and the goals and the outcomes of your committee. Because if you do end up finding that your strongest candidate for a faculty position is a Southeast Asian candidate, and one of the white men who applied or one of the white women who applied hears that someone on the committee had said, you know, we really should hire, you know, a black or brown person for this, then they have that basis for a claim too. And they might say, I wasn't hired because I'm white, when in fact they weren't hired because they weren't the best candidate. And so you've undermined your committee and you've undermined your decisions by making those types of statements. What we do want is we do want to create a diverse faculty in accordance with our EEO plans and in accordance with our EEO program and in accordance with the law. That is not the same as saying we want to hire a black person for this role.
So Lisa, tell us about what a committee should do when those words are uttered. Someone says, well, you know, aren't we looking for, or shouldn't we, you know, whatever the category, characteristic might be. Something is heard by the committee, what would be your expectations of the committee after hearing that, someone saying that?
So I have a couple of expectations. Expectation number one is what I would consider bystander intervention, right? Someone else on the committee, especially all of you having been in this training with me, someone else on the committee should say, no, that's not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is the best candidate, and we are interviewing a diverse group of candidates to find the best candidate. And the second thing that you should do is that you should reach out to your HR team. And not in a, this person needs off the committee kind of way, right? Because that might not be the case, like, right? That might not be the solution in that scenario. But it's better for HR to be aware of these things so that they can take steps to do interventions if they need any. Maybe it's someone from the HR team sitting down with that person and talking through the EEO plan and what our expectations are and what they should be looking for and what the criteria is, and very clearly and explicitly saying that they should never say anything like that ever again. Like whatever the case may be, sometimes an intervention may be needed. And it's also important for HR to know, because when a claim comes up, it's usually not going to come to you. It's going to come to them. And if they're not aware of the issues, they are caught flat-footed. And it makes it harder for them to be able to respond and address issues when after the fact, especially if a decision has already been made, all the candidates have been interviewed, and then this issue comes up. And so I am expecting at least those two things: intervention and communication. Charlie, anything additional you're expecting?
That was it.
Great. So when we're thinking about it, the benefits of workforce diversity also serve our core mission. We talked at the beginning about our commitment and the fact that we have that core belief that diverse workforces create better service, they create stronger community, that it does have a positive impact overall for the district and for the community college, and it's an imperative for us. And it's not an imperative in a we're making unlawful decisions kind of way, all right? I'm gonna say that multiple times throughout this session. It's not an imperative in a we're trying to create quotas or goals or making unlawful decisions. It's an imperative in we want to ensure that we're giving access and opportunities to as many people as possible and really taking into account the different criterias and the different ways that people may be qualified for a position, and not going back to the old sort of playbook on what makes a good candidate. Really thinking about what the appropriate criteria, what the appropriate skills, what the appropriate attributes are for this position, keeping in mind the global goal of having a diverse workforce, because that is good for us as a community, it's good for the college, it's good for our students. So we sort of talked about the benefits to our students. So now let's talk about eliminating bias in the hiring process. Because bias is something that we all have. Like it or not, it's a part of who we are as human beings, mainly because our brains are trying to make quick decisions. So all of you came into this room, you're all sitting in a chair right now. When you came into the room, did you ask yourself whether that was a chair? Did you spend any time thinking about what the chair was for? Did you analyze whether it was something you could sit in? No, because you know what a chair is for. You came in, you saw a chair, you sat down. Now, you might have opinions about the chair, about how comfortable the chair is, whether or not you like the chair, right? You might have lots of opinions about the chair. But you know what? The chair is not going to be offended. And if you don't like the chair and you have opinions about the chair and you decide, you know what, I'm not going to sit in this chair, I'm going to stand in the back the whole session, the chair is not filing a lawsuit, right? And so you can make quick, snap judgments about things of that nature because they're not important in that sense, right? They're not impactful in that sense. They don't actually impact another person's ability to thrive and succeed. The decision around this chair really is of no consequence to anyone other than maybe your back when you leave here, right? But when we make those same type of quick, snap decisions about people, about decisions that we're making in the hiring process, because you all have been entrusted with this critical role of interviewing candidates and making decisions and making recommendations that will impact the future of this college and the future of your students. When you make decisions like that, where your bias impacts those decisions, that is a problem. And that can be the basis of a claim, or it could be the basis of a lack of diversity in your school, which also has long-term implications and impact, and ultimately, it could also lead to disciplinary action for you. And so all of those things are things that we're trying to avoid. And so we want to be aware that bias does exist and be aware of our own biases. So some things that we have to deal with when we're thinking about barriers to an equal employment opportunity and to having a diverse workforce is implicit and unconscious bias. It's also the systemic barriers, which we've been talking about throughout, and then sometimes these confusing and sometimes contradictory laws that we've talked about the last hour as well. So implicit bias, unconscious bias, are generally assumptions that we make. They can be positive, they can be negative, and we make them without even realizing because they're biases that we formed over time based on our own experiences, based on what we've been exposed to, who we interact with. Generally speaking, we favor our in-groups, and sometimes often runs counter to what we believe our own values are. Because I don't think anyone in here would say, I'm biased against a person, and no one wants to be biased against a person, but you may unintentionally have that bias. And so part of what we do when we're in these roles where we're making decisions about people's lives, where we're making decisions that have this type of impact, are taking steps. We want to take steps that combat any potential bias that we may have, actually being intentional to ensure that we're minimizing and eliminating the effect of any bias that we might have. So it's important to note that biases can play a significant role, particularly when there's ambiguity, when there's stress, or when you're making quick decisions. The purpose of a hiring committee is that you have a deliberative body so that you're not making quick, snap judgment decisions. I also just want to reiterate here that while people love to rely on their guts, your gut is not reliable. And so when you're making decisions like these, it should not be based on your gut or your instincts. It should be based on the actual qualifications and the information that you have about the candidates before you, about the candidates who you have interviewed, about the candidates you spent all of that deliberate and diligent time getting to know and asking questions that were relevant to the position that they were hiring for. That's the information you should rely on when ultimately making your decision. And unconscious and implicit bias can affect so many things. It can affect our perception, right? So how we see people and how we perceive reality. It can affect our attitudes towards people, our behavior, how receptive and friendly we are. Do we smile at the candidate when they first come in the room or not? Right? Do we have an automatic affinity to that person? Sorry. Okay, you've got to be kidding me. Yes, just leave me alone. All right. You know, our attention and who we pay attention to, right? There are studies that show that women's voices don't register in the same way sometimes for different people. That's something to be mindful of, right? If it's something where you might not have heard everything that that candidate said, then you really want to rely on your other committee members and really take into account their input as well about what the candidate said. Sometimes you'll have these conversations and deliberations and you'll be like, oh, I didn't hear her say that at all, or I didn't hear him say that at all. And so really taking advantage of the fact that you have multiple people as part of the committee so that you can each sort of weigh in on the various different aspects that you gathered from that candidate as you went through the process. It also impacts, you know, how much or how little we sympathize with certain people as well. So our micro-affirmations and how we interact with people. And so there are so many ways that it can impact just our general interactions with the person, which can then impact how they feel in that room when they're interviewing. Because if a candidate walks in and everyone's smiling, they're more likely to feel welcomed and included in that room. You know, you could all be serial killers, but the smile would still make them feel more comfortable. If they come in and everyone's stone-faced or looks upset, that's gonna automatically make them a little bit more nervous. And maybe those nerves cause them not to perform at the level that they otherwise would have performed. And so thinking about our own behaviors when we're interacting and interviewing candidates is valuable and important. You know, there is an IAT test that Harvard has to help you determine your own potential biases. I find that the value of the test, if you take it, is so that you can gain awareness, so that you can then determine how you proceed with your behavior based on that awareness. So I'll use myself as a personal example. I've taken the IAT test. Turns out that I have a bias in favor of Asians. It's actually not surprising because both of my mom's best friends growing up were Chinese, or are Chinese, they're both still alive. So both of my mom's best friends growing up are Chinese. I spent all of my time with their kids and their families, and I have a strong affinity to them. I grew up with them, knowing them as my aunts. And now, today, my best friend is Asian. I don't think that's a coincidence, right? Like there was probably an attraction that I already had because of a comfort level and an affinity that I have to that particular group because of my experiences and my backgrounds. Now that's a positive bias, but even a positive bias could have a negative effect because if I'm interviewing 5 candidates and I happen to have more affinity or attraction to the Black candidate and the Asian candidate, then I'm no longer given the same value and the same credit to the other candidates that I'm interviewing as well. And so even that potential positive bias could negatively impact one of the candidates, could negatively impact someone else. So me having that awareness, I will gut check myself when I'm making a decision so that I can see, what were the objective criteria? What skills and attributes did this candidate have that made them the best candidate? Is it based on my potential bias in favor of this group, or is it based on them being the strongest candidate? Affinity bias is one of the most common that we see, and it doesn't have to just be by race or ethnicity. It can be by school affiliations, right? I went to Cal for undergrad. If I see someone, I'm gonna say go Bears, they're gonna say go Bears. I automatically like them more than everyone else, right? Right, go Bears. And so, but we need to be aware of that, right? When we're seeing candidates, when they're coming in, when we're interviewing them, recognizing that that affinity might be something that we're taking into account. Some other examples might include attribution error, so that tendency to blame someone. So if we see someone who maybe went to a lower ranked school, blaming them, maybe their education, their abilities, their skill set for them not going to a higher ranked school. The availability or recency bias, so if you're interviewing 5 candidates, the person you saw last or the person you saw first tends to stick with you the most. And that's why it's really important to really make your notes and give everyone the fair and due consideration when you're going through the interview process. Confirmation bias is a big one. So if you're reviewing someone's resume, you identify things on their resume, you've made some snap judgments, some potential assumptions about that candidate. When they come in to interview, you're more likely to hear the things that confirm what you already believe about them. Because your mind will seek the confirmation and disregard the things that don't confirm it. And this is another one of the benefits of a committee, because you all are coming in with different confirmation biases, right? And so hopefully you balance each other out and can get to the truth of what a candidate's actual qualifications and skill sets are. And then the danger, though, of the committee, the potential negative side of the committee, is the groupthink. So the idea that, especially if the thought is coming from the committee chair or someone who's viewed as having a little bit more authority or leadership, right? So if you have a view, you're sharing something objective about a candidate, something that they said, something that they focused on, try not to be swayed the moment someone else says, oh yeah, but that candidate's not great because they went to this school. Right? Because there is a common tendency to sort of just build on to that idea because of the danger of groupthink. You're each members of the committee for a reason. You all have been selected, you all have been vetted, this process has been reviewed, and so trust that you are there because you have a role to play on that committee, and so don't stay silent when you believe that there might be a tendency towards one of these biases. We're gonna talk about fit for a second. There are differences between fit. Sometimes people are a good cultural fit because they're collaborative and they're team builders and they have all of these great qualities. If they have those qualities, that's what you should be saying. I personally never like to see the word fit in a review, in a feedback, in anything. And I like to avoid it in conversations as well about candidates. Because what does fit translate into for some people? If your faculty is not as diverse as you otherwise are trying to achieve, and you say someone is not a good fit, unfortunately, the way that's going to be interpreted is they're not like everyone else here. And so if you're basing if your statement that they're not a good fit is shorthand for we're looking for someone who is going to be collaborative, who's going to work well with others, who's going to work well across differences, who is going to recognize and appreciate our diverse student body, and this person doesn't have those qualifications, that is what you should be saying. So myth number one, whether a candidate resonates with you on a personal level provides a reliable predictor of whether the candidate will do a good job. You are not the gauge of whether or not someone's going to do a good job. And if you think you are the gauge of whether or not someone is going to do a good job, you need to talk to Charlie, right? Because that's a problem, right? So let's ensure that we're not looking for ourselves. We are not looking to clone the people in this room as part of the interview process. We are looking to hire the best candidates for the role, for our college, for our students, and for the overall faculty. And so the goal here is not to find yourself. If you are interviewing and you feel like you are looking in the mirror, then that's another sign that you should check any potential biases as you're weighing in on the decision-making for that candidate. Yes? You look like you have a question. No, here. Me? Yeah, you looked like you had a question.
I don't have my glasses and I was trying to read it.
Well, so the myth number 2, which you were trying to read, I'll read for you, is that how someone performs in an interview setting provides a reliable predictor of how that person will interact with them in the work setting. So that's also not true. Remember I said earlier, the world is built for extroverts. The interview process is sort of built for extroverts. So how someone does in an interview isn't necessarily going to be a reliable predictor for how they're going to perform in the role that you're hiring them for. So try to look past just the optics of a candidate or the presentation of a candidate. There are some roles where presentation is important, right? We wouldn't want to hire someone to do this training if they didn't present well, right? That would be a qualification for this job if you were looking for someone to do it. But if it's not something that requires that, then try to take that off the table because that can be a barrier to creating equal opportunities for different candidates. So you want to continually monitor your reaction to candidates because as I said earlier, your reaction can impact their interview and how they perceive themselves and then ultimately how they perform. So you want to ask yourself, what's the basis for your positive or negative reaction? Is your reaction grounded in the content of the candidate's performance? Are you reacting to what they actually said and measuring based on their questions and their responses to their questions? Is your reaction disproportionate to the response? Like I've had candidates come into my office for interviews. When they left, my energy was just drained. I was just like, you are too much. I don't even want to interact with you on a regular basis because just this interaction was too much. And you know, because I do our recruiting for the Orange County office for Shepherd, and I had an associate who I interviewed who I felt that way. And I left my office after their interview, and I walked to one of my colleagues' office and I said, you know, he is a great candidate, but that was not the energy that I needed. And so I am not gonna weigh in on this decision. So I didn't weigh in on that decision. I let that decision be based on the other people in the committee who had done that interview because I recognized that my reaction to this candidate had nothing to do with their qualifications. It really just was not a good fit in that moment. And we ended up extending an offer to that candidate, and they spent 11 weeks with us over the summer, and he was amazing. And he now has an offer to come back with us when he graduates from law school. And so if I had allowed my reaction, which was an outsized reaction to the candidate, to cloud the decision, right, me as the recruiting chair weighing in and swaying the group, then we would have missed out on this great candidate who is going to be a wonderful addition to our firm. And so that's something to be mindful of, your own interactions, your own presence when you come into an interview. We're all human. Sometimes we have good days, sometimes we have bad days, sometimes interviews are scheduled on our bad days, right? Let's not allow where we are and how we're coming into the interview impact the candidate's ability to have equal access to opportunity. So some things you want to do is identify desirable interview answers before you start seeing the candidates. So having your criteria set up understanding what you're looking for. Otherwise, that recency bias can definitely have more of an impact, or because then you're like, oh, that answer was really great. And rather than comparing every candidate against the criteria, you start comparing every candidate against that person's answer, and we want to avoid that as well. So you want to have that structured hiring process. The fact that we have a committee, that we're doing this training, that we're going through all this process, we already have a structure in place. So we want to follow that structure. And then use skill-based testing. Again, not skills based on the person in the role, but based on the actual skills needed for that role. And then discuss the candidates with low scores in the same way you discuss candidates with high scores. Because people might have low scores for different reasons. And understanding what the factors were, what the criteria were when giving that score has value as well. So just some things to keep in mind. You know, hiring has been happening for a long time. People are generally resistant to change, and so they're more likely to continue to do things the way they've always done them. And so you want to think about whether names, prior employers, schools attended, writing style might create bias around a social class, race, or ethnicity, or gender, having all of those things in mind. You know, some employers are moving towards, for example, blind resumes, where you take the name off the resume just to avoid some of that bias. By the time they get to you, you know their name. They're sitting in front of you, right? So that's not really an option for you. But keeping in mind what assumptions you might be making based on that person's name, based on their address, based on their experience, based on their background. So some different areas where these things can come up, right, is that some issues that might arise as you're going through the committee that might not be based on some of those biases we've already talked about, but personal biases. So do you know the candidate? Have you heard of the candidate? Did you Google the candidate? Please don't Google candidates. Like, please don't. Like, people love to do that. And I'm really asking that you not. Like, it is not your job as the hiring committee to go and research candidates. There are people who do that. There's a background check process. It is not your role. And so please do not do that, because what ends up happening is it will derail a committee. Someone will come in with some information that they found somewhere, whether it be for them from their neighbor, online, or somewhere else, and then the entire conversation becomes about that thing, and not about the actual candidate's qualifications. So as a committee, try to focus on the actual information that's relevant to the role and the information that's relevant about that candidate. Support your decisions, your opinions, your views with actual information in the candidate's file, actual information from the candidate's interview. So based on the universe that you should actually be considering when making your decision, those are the things that you should point to when expressing a view or opinion about a candidate in the committee. To the extent that it's an even field, there's a split decision, then leaning towards inclusion rather than inclusion is important and it's valuable, because we're still aligned with our EEO plan, with our goals and our objectives of creating a diverse work environment and creating a diverse faculty. So I'm going to break you out at your tables.
I'd like to add something real quick on that,
Yeah,
too.
sure.
So, and connecting back to, because we've heard this in the past, too, connecting back to the part about lowering standards, we're not including at the extent of lowering standards. So if inclusion means you've got 3 great candidates or 4 great candidates, that's fine, but it's not, we've got 3 and then half the committee is kind of waffling on that one. That committee by consensus needs to forward people who they can all live with, and that those standards are still met, right? And so don't forward people that you think, well, the committee's kind of undecided, so let's just kick it up, so let the president decide, or let whatever decide. The committee needs to be comfortable with who they're being forwarded, no matter how many. So you want to include if you're undecided about things, but don't lower the standard where the consensus is no longer the consensus. So I want to be sure that that's clear, right? That everyone needs to be forwarded who the committee can live with. That's the bottom line. Because we're not lowering standards for inclusion, but we do want to be inclusive when the standards are there for everyone, and we can't decide on if it's 2 or 3 or 3 or 4. Then you want to lean toward inclusion in that way. But you're not doing it at the expense of lowering the standards, that everyone's not on board with who's going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's think about this question at your table. You have a candidate come through, you've interviewed all of your people, you're now deliberating about who moves forward. It turns out that one of the candidates has an arrest record, not a criminal conviction, an arrest record. And someone knows, because they Googled, and they have that information. And now they share with you all that that this person has an arrest record, and this is what they were arrested for, some domestic violence issue. They're believed to have abused their husband. What do you do? So I'll give you a few minutes to talk amongst each other, and then I'd love to get some feedback from the group. All right. And we are back. So who wants to share? There was a lot of robust dialogue. I like the amount of discussion there was around this. So who would like to share? You can't just wait for me to give you the answer. Okay.
Along the same lines, so in our pools, and part of our process requirement is that you interview expert number of associate faculty that are on the pool, right? So how are associate faculty who don't have a great working record weeded out of this? The first door on the right.
She's talking about part-time faculty and associate faculty. I'm sorry, say the question one more time.
So how are they, let's say we have an associate faculty member who has had not great evaluations, and that's known amongst the faculty because we're obviously working with this individual. How are they weeded out of the pool, and are we still required to interview?
So evaluations are not part of the screening process.
Yeah. Assumes facts, not in evidence. Right? So you're not weeding them out.
No, not based on evaluations, no.
So then can we use that knowledge because it's applicable work experience?
The committee, sure, so the committee is not to consider that, but if someone has knowledge of that, they should tell HR so that we are sure to be, because we wouldn't want to hire someone who wasn't eligible for employment or whatever, or that sort of thing. But if there's something that is of concern, the hiring manager may or may not want to be aware of that, may want to be aware of that in the context of what you're saying, but it's not for the committee to decide that. So if there's, so it could, and we were talking at our table, for example, what if someone knows something that they lied during the interview? Like they're lying about what they're saying, right? I know they're lying about what they're saying. Then whether, an external committee, an external candidate, you may not know that ever, and they may be lying too. But the idea is that you go with what the evidence you have in front of you, and if you have some other information that may affect their candidacy, it is not for the committee to necessarily decide that, but report it to HR, and then we'll weigh the merit of whether or not that's really important or not. Because what we want to do is we want to give each candidate the best chance to get hired, but we also want to be sure we're not breaking any laws, and we also want to be sure that there's good reason for why we may or may not want to hire a candidate. When it gets to an evaluation, that's a personal matter. People shouldn't really necessarily know someone's evaluation unless someone shared it, and you don't really know all the facts of that anyway, unless you're the hiring manager that wrote it itself. You still want to stick to what's happening, the evidence in front of you. The safe harbor is go with the facts in front of you, regardless of what they say or not, in terms of whether you know they're lying or not. Go with what they say and make your decisions based on that. And if you think there's something wrong with what they're saying, the integrity of what they're saying, the information, because people lie on the resumes too, right? People will say they have degrees and they don't, and that's why we ask for transcripts, because at the end of the day, we're going to validate this stuff. So that's our job, though. Our job is to validate the truthfulness of their application.
John, can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
So that seems pretty clear for things that like lying or like not eligible for reemployment and stuff like that. But I imagine in most departments like ours, we have kind of an incestuous relationship with our associate faculty. Many of our associates are going to apply for these full-time jobs, and some of them have been associates for 10 or 15 years. We've all been chairs when they were associates, and we've evaluated them. We have knowledge outside of the committee materials. At my previous job, we were told we had to ignore that and just use the materials. Here at Mira Costa, it's been a little squishier in the past. It's like, well, if you personally have firsthand knowledge, then you can tell the committee and you can give the evidence. And I was kind of nervous about that. So what's the word today?
Right, so we were just talking about that at our table too. We have waffled a little bit. So where we are right now is things like secondhand knowledge, Google information, all that sort of stuff. If there's a concern about the integrity of the applicant, you want to tell HR and let us do that work. Your job as committee members is to work with what information is in front of you. Here, that's it. So their application, bless you, their application, their interviews, that information that you have evidence of, or as you know, that is testimony in front of you, that's what you're working with. If there's anything that you think could affect their candidacy for other reasons, let HR know and let us do whatever background checks or homework that we need to do to validate that. Because at that point in time, we would then intervene with, if there's something that we need, that a candidate should not be forwarded for whatever reason.
Well, no, I'm not talking about things that would keep them out. I mean, we have, I don't know, 20 associates. Some, frankly, are better than others. That might be of interest to the hiring committee, but then I feel like I'm bringing that in, and I don't only have that for 1 or 2 people, so it seems unfair.
Right, it is unfair. It is unfair. You want to do what they present as an applicant. You want them on that. That's the merit of what you want to do the evaluation on, okay?
So closed universe, right? We're closing the universe to what actually happens with this candidate, with each candidate in the application, the resume, the review, the interview process. Right? So all of the other things, they're extraneous. I did hear some of the conversations as you all were going through about the arrest record. I made it an arrest intentionally because arrest doesn't mean they did it. They didn't get convicted. They weren't found guilty by a jury. They didn't take a plea. It just means that they were arrested. And in the same way that every employer can be sued by anyone for anything, people can be arrested, sometimes for misunderstandings, sometimes because people are, trying to game the system. Who knows? We don't know what the background and the information is on that, and we don't want to make decisions based on that information, based on something that we have no reason to know whether it's true or not true. We don't have the ability or the knowledge, and we don't want to spend our time in the interview asking a candidate about it. Because the other piece here as well is that California does have very strict background check laws. There's laws around the timing of background checks and inquiries regarding criminal history and arrests. There are specific laws against considering arrests that don't result in conviction. There are all of these different aspects that are better held with your HR team. So it is not up to you all as the committee to analyze and assess whether someone who was arrested for some crime, even if that arrest is pending right now, whether or not they did it and whether or not that disqualifies them from the position that they're applying for. Those types of decisions, those discussions, we want to leave with your HR team, and you all want to focus on the specific task that you have been engaged to do, which is to review all of the applicant materials, interview the candidates, and make a recommendation based on those materials and the interview. Yes?
So I have a question regarding the last part, looking at that quote, looking at the scenarios, that the committee member clearly has a bias.
Yeah.
And I noticed this, or for me, it happened a long time ago, but I was on was standing here at America's Presidential Search Committee, there was an internal candidate that someone on the committee said, I will never vote to move her forward. And that was a wrap. No one on that table, but now, of course, this is 30 years ago or so, right? And so, but I'm like, okay. So now I'm hearing what Charlie said about, well, what if you can't? Don't come sneaking up behind me. I'm about to have a reaction. All I want is like that, just like reading when I do that. But so now Charlie is saying, look, what I just heard was, your committee needs to be really comfortable or a consensus of who you send forward. Well, what if everyone else on the committee is down for this person except for the one person that clearly has demonstrated a bias against this person?
So remember that conversation we had earlier about what you should do when someone raises issues in your committee and what needs to be done about that? In that situation where there appears to be a clear bias, Charlie and his team are there to support you in that. And that's something you need to be escalating, because that might be a situation where we need to remove them from the committee, right?
And I have an example of that. We had in a former district, not here. Former district, not here.
The names have
Not
been
here.
changed.
Not
the
here.
names have been changed to protect the.
We had a dean who learned that a candidate went to law school and on the strength of on a law degree, got hired and that whole thing as a minimum qualification. But at the time of her graduation, the school was not accredited. At the time of her graduation. But then later on, the school got accredited. Not at the time, whatever. So anyway, fast forward, she's, this other person is working, and now she's up for a president's job at this college. And so this dean didn't like this person. And so they rang the bell. This person's, she has a degree from an unaccredited institution at the time. And so she's like, as far as I read the rules, she doesn't qualify, right? Trying to get her booted out on that qualification. So HR, they paused, HR did their research, they landed on including the person because she was already employed there based on those qualifications. So they're in a spot where she's already been hired, she's in another job that has that same MQ, and she's working there. So we're not gonna kick her out because you brought this thing. Well, she says, ain't no way I'm voting for this person, right? I'm just not doing it. They called HR, HR came in, knocked her out, she was done. And said that she was like, we're not gonna do it.
Yeah, well, to clarify, knocked her out in the figurative sense.
Of the committee, yes, of the committee. Yes, of the committee. They pulled her off of the committee. They pulled her, yeah, sorry, yes. Sorry. They pulled her off of the committee because she was so biased, right, that it was disruptive to the committee. They could not productively have a discussion around her candidacy. So they removed her from the committee. And so it was an HR intervention. So those are the kind of things where if you see something like that and a person is like, I'm not giving in, there's no way that's gonna happen. Then if the committee is like, we can't settle this, get us involved, we'll assess whether or not, it's really, that person needs to be removed or not. But in that case, that's what happened. She was removed from the committee. So, case in point to what she was saying.
So that's all I gotta do, get removed from that.
Yeah, that's all you gotta do. Yeah, and you know what? And Bruce, listen, wait, Bruce. Listen, it doesn't have to be that dramatic. You could just simply say, I'm taking myself off the committee. You don't have to be that dramatic. It doesn't have to be that much drama involved. Oh, I understand.
Well, you know what's gonna happen, Bruce, is that you're gonna get removed from the committee, and then when you apply for something in the future, that committee is gonna say you were biased, so you're not eligible. You get disqualified. So any other groups have anything else, any other thoughts that you talked about on this scenario that we haven't already covered or addressed?
Yes.
I want to bring up a situation that I see a lot. Charlie, you're talking about the comment whether you can live with the candidates, whether they're going to be bored or not. That feels a lot like fitting. So that term feels a little squishy. But how I've seen this play out is, there is a committee making a decision, but someone will say, hey, you're the one who's going to work directly with them. And so you start to privilege one person, like their vote, more than the rest of them. So I'm curious about those situations.
I would say don't do that. Don't do that. Don't, right? I mean, you're all committee members and you all should wait. Now, I appreciate someone having, strong feelings about their candidacy in terms of the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, abilities that were presented and that sort of thing. But to default and say, well, you're going to have to work with that person, puts an undue responsibility. And the hiring manager is the person that needs to make that decision. It's not the committee, right? The committee is forwarding. Your job is to screen. You're a screening committee. You're not the selection committee. You're a screening committee. So the person that will decide the hire will decide the appropriateness or their candidacy or whatever. And so that's a good question, Mike. And it's really not about fit, because that is kind of a fit kind of question. It's really not that. It's when I say someone you can live with, meaning they meet the standards by which they are going to be a good candidate, and you're screening against that standard. Then after that, someone's going to make a selection of that person based on their best information that they have available.
Yeah, and I want to double down on something I said earlier, which feeds into the point that Charlie was just making. Every one of you is on that committee for a reason. And so you should not defer to someone else on the committee and have your voice be silenced or sort of pass the buck on your contribution based on whatever privilege might put them in a better role, right? Whether they're the whether they're the head of the committee or someone else or in a leadership role, or they're someone who's going to be on the team that the person is going to work with, or there's someone who knows something, has some knowledge about this person in the past, if there's someone who has supervised them in the past, none of those things should be things where you are deferring your input and your contributions to the committee to that person. Because each of you is on there because you are valued as a contributor in this process. Yes.
I agree with you, like on the general level, but this is faculty hiring where we're also looking at subject matter expertise, and it's not true that everyone on the committee has equal subject matter expertise. Like, I don't get to weigh in on an equivalency decision or things like that. So, like, sometimes there's some nuance here that I'm just curious what you might say about that.
So,
because that's a big part of what we are looking at. And lots of times there's discipline specializations that really there is one or two people on the committee that are representing that, and that the others are listening to.
So that's not a reason to defer your input. It's a reason to consider the information that they're sharing, right? So if you have someone who has subject matter expertise that is relevant to the hiring decision and the candidate that you're considering, then you would ask that person to share the subject matter expertise with everyone in the room and their reasoning for their views, pointing to the information in the candidate's application, in their resume, in their responses. And then each member of the committee still has responsibility and accountability in weighing that additional information and giving their recommendation or giving their input. Right? So we're not passing the buck there, we're just considering that expertise and giving it what we deem to be the appropriate weight in that deliberation. Charlie, did you want to add something?
No, I think I couldn't actually agree with you more. That's perfect.
Yes.
Just kind of it brought up something for me. One of the things that we tended to have before in previous hiring is people that are at different stages of their careers. And as a Maricosta salary, we often will sort of snatch people away later in their career. And so you often have new people right out of grad school with very little, if any, experience up against people that, might have 20 years of experience. And I always sort of use in my head kind of where they are relative to their career position, for lack of a better term, but because I'm trying to not discriminate based on age. If it's just straight experience, the person that's been doing it 20 years will obviously have way more experience, but it also means then we're only going to be looking for older people. So can you speak to that?
Experience is one factor in all of the factors you're considering, right? So like, yeah, someone's gonna have 20 years experience, but what other skill sets do they have? What else do they bring to the table? So if you're looking to hire for a counselor position for a specific discipline, and you're looking for someone who has specific experience in relating to other people, in interacting in a specific way, in being able to communicate and convey information. The person with 20 years experience could have 20 years experience doing something completely different. And so the fact that they have the 20 years experience is a factor in like the knowledge and the expertise that they bring to the role, but it's not the deciding factor. So you should weigh all of the factors that are relevant to the position that you're hiring for, not giving any factor undue weight compared to other factors.
And so, for example, I know that I'm aware of a candidate, not here again, this is at another place, where they had 20 or 30 years of experience, but they didn't know how to use a computer. They had no modern skills in terms of what they could contribute to the interview. But they had lots of years of experience, and if that were the only factor, then fine, but you can sit in a job for 30 years and not accomplish anything. But what skills are you bringing? How are you relating to your students, or how are you making contributions to whatever it is that the job is requiring, right? Whatever those skills, right, and abilities. That's not necessarily experience. Those are different words. So yes, experience is certainly a factor, because if you have 20 years of experience in the things that you're looking for, and they can tell you all kinds of different stories and how they can impact their department and the students in the college now because of all that experience, and that's great, because they have other skills that are part of that factor. It's not just because it's 20 years. So it is a factor, but it's a factor. And it may not even be the dominant factor. It's what is it that they're going to do to contribute to the institution and the students that we're serving.
Thanks for that, Charlie. All right, anything else before we move on? One more? All right, Bruce. Bruce is active today. I even know his name. That's how you know he's active.
So, look, in this scenario, we're talking about someone who's clearly demonstrated a bias verbally, right? What advice or best practices exist for someone or people who may be demonstrating a bias that seems very clear to the rest of the community members, but is not outwardly or has not made some declarative statement about how biased they are? Example, everyone else on the committee rated someone as we have a 2-1 scale. And of the 7 or whatever, 5 of them or 4 of them, 2s, one was a 1, and then another 2 people said 0. And in my own humble opinion, I'm like, I don't know how you could get to 0 with this candidate. I'm wondering if a world of if some advice exists for that possible scenario.
You want to go first? You can go first and then I'll chime in.
Okay, so I would say it goes back to where we talked earlier about have conversations about the lower scoring people first. Like don't have that discussion. Like Why are they so low, or why is someone so high? Whatever it is, you want to talk about that. If at the end of the day, after that discussion has been had, and there's a bias, but it's not disrupting the discussion around where this is going to end up landing. So someone is like, you know, they're talking about it, and they're like, okay, I'm going to surrender to the committee because I see we're all saying, and you guys, that gets worked out or whatever. But if someone is not saying I have a bias, but I still think this person is due, and this is whatever, and I just feel like they're not given the right chance, and everyone else seems to not agree with this one person. And it's starting to disrupt now sort of your ability to actually get something done. That's when you want to seek some help, right? So you want to talk about it. Hopefully the conversation, the communication of that works out. And then if it looks like it's getting hung up on what now appears to be, the bias is now revealing itself in a way that isn't declarative, I'm biased, but you can see it, everyone sees it, then someone needs to say, can we pause this for a moment? Can we get HR? We need a little help. And then we can kind of help assess that.
So the only thing that I'm going to add is I'm going to go a little bit earlier in the process to how we get them to that declarative space. This is where everyone gets to be 5 again. You just get to keep asking why, right? Because if you continually to ask someone why they feel a certain way, they're going to need to explain that. And it's going to become pretty evident that they don't have a legitimate, objective rationale for the belief that they're conveying, right? So if you ask someone why, they might just say, well, at some point they're going to just say, well, that's just how I feel. And it's not about feelings. We're not making decisions based on feelings. And so by putting someone in the position where they need to point to the thing in the resume, the thing in the application, the thing that the candidate actually said in the interview process that explains why they gave them the 0, puts you in a position where you can get to see, puts the entire committee in a position where you can see whether their 0 is founded upon something, because maybe it is. Like, people have different things that they might hone into in an interview, and you know, I'm reviewing interview scores all the time, and there's sometimes a lot of range in them, and so there might be legitimate reasons for the range, but that person needs to be able to articulate those legitimate reasons. And if they're unable to articulate those legitimate reasons, it's going to become evident pretty quickly that it's based on something else, and that's when you're looking to HR to get that support.
And you may see, they may hang it up, they may base their opinion on something that was flawed in their application or in their interview, but that was really meaningful and important to them. Like, everyone may think that this one thing is not that big a deal, but I think it's a very big deal that he was late to work one day or whatever. And that's important to me because what I believe and blah, blah, blah. And so they may still give you some evidence. They may find a little piece to say, I rest my case on this one little thing that I think is important to me. They say their piece, you all talk about it. If it starts to disrupt what's happening, then you get us involved. But you do talk about it. You do ask them why. And then if they can give you a really good reason why, you consider that. And if they give you a reason that seems to be, they're just hung up, and they're using this as an excuse to base their bias, then you'll see it. And then you ask for our help.
Yes. I just have a quick question. I think it's kind of relevant in a whole bunch of stuff that we heard today. Will there today be some specific training around associate faculty candidates? Because I think that a lot of the questions that have been asked, a lot of the concerns that people have in a lot of our pools are going to contain existing employees. And I've done this training a lot of times. And the information about what to do, what can be shared, what they get in terms of ranking, how to build your pool and who to put forward has changed even over the course of the 13 years that I've been here. So I wonder if there isn't training here today, if what the right thing would be to do as just a committee is to then go to HR and say, listen, we recognize this is happening. Can just my little committee have some reminders or have some focus time, especially for committee members who are newer, maybe this is their first time, and just because, you know, John was kind of joking, like, you rest on your past experiences. I I remember something about what we can and can't do, but I'm not certain what has or hasn't changed, and I do think that many of us are gonna have rules that contain associates that are gonna have specific questions around that.
So you're talking about hiring of associate faculty for their position, yeah. Yes, yes. So we're recording this, we're gonna make this, available for that as a resource as we work our way through that. We are looking at how we can enhance and improve the way that we do associate faculty hiring.
No, they mean considering associate candidates. So like how the conversation that you all were having about at the back table around what you can consider and sort of this closed universe that we're talking about, what she's asking for is additional guidance on how they should approach situations when an associate candidate is applying for a faculty position.
Okay, so we haven't developed anything specific for today, but that's something for us to take back and do further. Thanks. So in an example that I explained, you may see that in a demonstration. So a teacher gives a demonstration, they're not using a certain technology that might be modern or whatever, and if you ask that question in the interview about what technology do you use for that, whatever, and they start identifying outdated technology or whatever, you will learn that appropriately through that interview process. And you can ask questions like, tell us what technology you've used, to help do whatever it is that you're trying to do. I'm sure a lot of the technology, especially if you're like in computer science, you better be current on the kind of stuff that you're doing. So if technology is a big piece, or anything else that may be not relevant to the skills that you're looking for, you design your questions, you do all those things to try and discover that. In terms of what's important to you. So
if you have that knowledge because the person has been working with you.
That's not how we're going to share it.
No.
But that's what I'm saying.
That's how we're not going to get it.
Right.
Go to HR separately and just say, listen, this person was moved forward. I
Yes.
got this out of it, but like this is important. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, those are offline communications with HR. And I want to reiterate something that Charlie touched on in that response, which is those questions need to be based on the questions that you've developed and designed and are asking all of the candidates. So you don't want to ask only the candidate over 40 about their technology and how current they are on computers and apps and all of the things. You want to, if that's something that's relevant to the job, then you need to be asking all the candidates about that. All right. So just some things to keep in mind when you're doing your hiring. For the hiring committees, right, we're going to make sure that they're diverse. That's something the HR committee is going to review, and the people who are putting together the committees are going to make sure. They must be trained. Here we are. And don't participate if you can't fairly and objectively evaluate candidates. If you're a relative by blood or marriage or adoption, if you have any form of bias that you know you can't step away from in the hiring decision, in the deliberation, that's something that you should notify HR about and recuse yourself from that committee as it relates to those candidates. So there's a certain level of accountability and responsibility that we expect from each of you to understand where you are and whether or not you can be objective in the hiring process. So moving through some of these, because we've touched on a lot of this as we've talked through. So we've talked about interview questions throughout. We want to make sure that we're actually asking questions that are designed to elicit information that is going to help us identify the best candidate for the role. And so some of that may mean asking behavioral questions, which are usually going to be the best predictors of future performance, because you can tell from how people have handled things in the past how they're likely to handle things in the future. And so giving people scenarios that actually happen in the position that you're hiring for, and understanding how they solve issues, how they approach the problem. The actual resolution is not necessarily the determinant factor. It's really the skill set and the steps that they take to reach that decision and that outcome that are really relevant in how they're going to address issues in the future. So we want to keep in mind when we're asking people, when we're interviewing people, when we're creating those questions for the candidates, what does this role do? And what is skill sets, what attributes does this person need to have to be able to succeed in this role? What are we relying on this person to actually accomplish? And ensuring that our questions are trying to elicit that type of information. So, as you're developing your format, having a helpful lead-in can sometimes be useful. Open-ended questions, right? This is not a true or false exam. This is not a guess my right answer type situation. We're really trying to understand about the candidate, who they are, and how they qualify for the role, and then understanding and having sort of that assessment as to what the desired answers are, and not this is verbatim what we want to hear, but these are the key components that we would expect to hear from the ideal candidate for this role. So establish ground rules and follow them as a committee. One of the things that I see that is most problematic in hiring decisions is the lack of consistency through the hiring process. So if you keep changing the criteria, if you keep changing the qualifications, if you keep changing the questions with each candidate, then you're not in a position to be able to compare the candidates to each other, because you create an apples versus oranges situation instead of an apples versus apples situation. And then remember, you are being interviewed too, right? The person they're making a decision about whether MiraCosta is the right place for them too, and so you want to present well on behalf of the organization. I generally recommend a 75-25 rule. 75% of the dialogue should be coming from the candidate, 25% should be coming from you. So you want to protect the integrity and the credibility of your process. We talked about in the beginning some of the challenges that you can face from a legal perspective if the decisions that you make are being questioned because the process didn't seem fair to the candidate. So some of the things that we talked about already, assessing all candidates using the same criteria and measures, not bringing outside knowledge and information. That's unfair to the candidates that you're interviewing because you don't have that information for everyone. Leaving background checks to HR, right? That's in their purview to deal with. Attending all the meetings, being neutral and objective. And if you can't be neutral and objective, recognizing that and conveying that. Being meaningful consideration of the sensitivity to diversity without being discriminatory in any way. Doing it right the first time, so be committed to the process and really contribute and don't defer to other people. Monitor your processes and then maintain confidentiality. There's been a lot of discussion about how many of your candidates are people who work for the college right now. That makes confidentiality extremely important. Because if your committee is leaking and information is out there, that's going to go through it's going to filter through the faculty like wildfire. And so you want to ensure that you're maintaining that confidentiality. Yes?
I don't know if this is going to be addressed in the future slide or not, so I have a question about follow-up questions. And so in reference to follow-up questions, if you have a follow-up question for one candidate, does that mean that every candidate should get the same follow-up question? Or can they be individualized based on the schedule?
That's a good one.
Okay, so the answer to that question for us is you are allowed to vary on follow-up questions on candidates, because a candidate may tell you something that just needs additional clarity. And you just might simply say, look, tell me a little bit more about what you're saying. You're not going to ask that of everybody else. right? They may say something that you're just not certain about, or they might cite a law that you're not familiar with, and you might say, I'm not sure, can you tell me a little bit more how that applies to whatever, and someone else may not mention that other law or whatever. So we encourage you, actually, to ask follow-up questions. Be mindful of your time, because you ask too many, then the candidate won't have a chance to actually get through their interview questions. But we do encourage you to do your due diligence around being sure that you fully understand the candidate's candidacy. If that means follow-up questions, then that means follow-up questions. But the follow-up questions must be related to the question that you asked originally. It can't be some new question, right? You got 10 questions, and your 11th question is, tell me a little bit more about one of those other 10, or clarifying the answer that they had. But it's not, it doesn't give, so I personally actually had an example of that happening to me. At another college. And it was a 10-person panel with 20 questions, 2-person apiece. I got down to the last question, asked this person to my left, and I answered the 20th question, and he said, I have a follow-up question. And he asked the monitor, because that committee had a monitor, said, can I ask a follow-up question? The person said yes. His question was completely unrelated to the 20th question. It was completely, not only was it unrelated, it was actually an inappropriate question. So the point is that we encourage you to do it, be mindful of your time, be sure it's connected to something that you've already asked. That way it's not different. You're not treating the candidates differently from everybody else.
So I love that we have addressed so many of the things I already had in my best practices through this robust dialogue. And so we can skip through most of those slides. And we're coming to the end just on the Equal Employment Opportunity Plan. We talked about it in the beginning around the Title V requirements, around the college's plan. The college does have a plan. It's 60 pages. You can break it into smaller reads if you don't want to read all 60 at the same time. But you're all academics. You know, you're reading things like this all the time. But it is important to know that there is an equal employment opportunity plan that the college is committed to. Those statements and commitments that I went through at the beginning, they are in your EEO plan, and it includes information around definitions of all of the terms. It includes the policy statement, the diversity statement. It includes the notice requirements. It was updated in October 2023, so it's recent and includes all of the changes under the law as well that we talked about earlier. So I do recommend that you invest the time in reading through the plan as you're proceeding with the hiring process. And so, you know, some of the information that's in here includes the data analysis that Charlie had talked about earlier, you know, the faculty demographic data that, you know, we look at and we're considering when we're ensuring that we have that diverse candidate pool. And then we have the resources that are available as well for the California Community College's Chancellor offices has created a guide for using longitudinal data. That's something that Charlie and his team are going to rely on more. But all of those things are referenced in your plan. All right? Any other questions? Well, success, because no questions at the question slide.
So there's a couple of things I want to be sure that we talk about that to make you aware that is new to our plan that we did adopt in October. What should I say? We revised it in October, but the board just approved it. You may have seen it go out on the MiraCoastan. There are some new strategies in our plan that we've never really had before. That was part of the new requirements. And they are connected to, so who has utilized the dashboard around the demographics for the college universities that we were putting out there as a resource tool for you all to help us do recruitments for your specific disciplines? We included some information about demographics related to college universities. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay, so can you tell me a little bit more about what you remember?
There was a table in an email, and the table said for different, I'm not sure what the classification was, but disproportionately impacted groups of students, which universities that are local specifically have high numbers of those students.
Yes.
So it was basically every school in Southern California, so I just contacted the chair of the either physics or math and science department from each school and said, please share this job announcement with your faculty and students,
Okay.
and that's what.
So yes, so that you all, what she's talking about is that basically we crafted a list of top 10, was it the top 10 colleges? Top 10, right? So we gave a top 10 list of colleges for marginalized populations, but very specific to your discipline. So for example, if you're looking for a chemistry hire, and we know that we have underrepresentation for Black, African American, and Asian populations for faculty, then we identified the colleges that graduate the highest number of Black, African American, and Asian colleges in Southern California. And there are only 10. So we didn't give you the 50 that are in Southern California, however many there are. We gave you the top 10. And we gave the top 10 so that you could then help us reach out to those colleges and universities to say, we know that you graduate the highest number of, pick a population, whatever it was based on what that data was that we got from ARPI. And we want you to build a relationship in your department with these colleges so that when you go to hire people, you know that there is this pool of people. We talk about how there's not enough marginalized population of people in this particular discipline, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? We're finding out where they actually are so that you all can reach out to them to help improve the diversity of the pools. And so that table that she's referring to is really your tool. It is our tool. It is our tool as an institution to help us do targeted outreach to help diversify our pools. Because once they get in the pool and we remove barriers in terms of bias and those kind of things, right, we have to hire the best candidate. We have to hire the best candidate, period. That's the best candidate. But the way that we can help diversify the pools is A, have a diverse pool to begin with, and then B, remove the barriers along the way throughout the process. So when you look at the recruitment email, the committee hires, there's a list of college universities with the marginalized populations. If you haven't already closed your recruitment, then look at that and reach out and see what you can do to drum up interest around that college university with those populations that we're looking to reach out to. So our AU plan, that is new for AU plan. That is something that we've never had before. It is something that I want to be sure that you all are aware of because that is something to leverage in a way that no one else is doing this like in the state that I'm aware of. I talk about it with people. I almost don't want to talk about it because I don't want anyone else to know about it so that we can go get the people that we need to do without everyone else doing it, right? But it is something that is uniquely different that we have as a tool that no one else really has. That we're leveraging this data, that the graduation rates for our local, and we do there's I think a Southern California, a California International kind of look that we do. That's in the EO plan. That strategy is in the EO plan. The information around the colleges is in your email. The other things that are in the plan that are new include all the pre-hire strategies that are listed toward the end. It's section 13. Some pre-hire strategies that we're doing around policies and that sort of thing. There's some hire strategies, the things that I just told you about, and there's some post-hire strategies that you should all be aware of because that's what we're trying to do around equal employment opportunity and the access all throughout, not just getting hired, but all the way to the end of your career, whenever you decide to leave. So that plan covers the strategies from beginning to the before, during the hire, and then after the hire. So take a look at that plan. We just got the board approved in January, something to pay attention to, and those strategies are. But that one that I just mentioned is really critical for us, and it's something that I really want to leverage because it's something that we get to really take a mind and take advantage of that no one else is really doing. Specific to Maricosta. No one in Sedica, no one in California, no one that I know of is doing what we're doing in that way. So let's take advantage of that.
That grid was discipline specific.
Discipline specific. That grid was discipline specific. We did not do a generic one. We said this discipline, these are the demographics for our graduate institutions, the highest number of. Meet those institutions, build a relationship with them, and encourage their graduates to want to be faculty members. Their alumni, all of it. Because they're the ones that graduate the highest number of whatever that population is for your discipline. All right, so I have one last thing I'd like to do. You all are on your own little hiring committees. Each table is your hiring committee, right? what thing so far, because we're going to do a little practice, what thing, the question that didn't get talked, or what topic didn't get talked about, that you think that you're in a hiring committee, you're going to run a scenario. We talked about one already. We talked about the arrest record. We talked about the Google. We talked about the bias of the person in right. And all the answers to that was if it gets out of control, out of your hands, you're going to contact HR, right? You try and solve it. If you can't solve it, you contact HR. That's kind of like that's the thing. What scenario have we not talked about that we need to talk about? What scenario have you experienced, or do we need to say, and it could be at another district, so that you all feel equipped when you leave here today. You can have your deliberations. When something comes up, you feel prepared to actually address it. Because we talked about the one where, someone needs to defend their position. If it's too high or too low, ask why, right? We talked about that one. The other ones that are pretty easy, most people are not gonna ask any questions around those protected classes. Tell us where you're from, tell us why you learned that language, right? Those are usually not the questions that committees falter on. Those are not the ones that really are the issues. The issues are, I feel like, it's not the legal stuff, but what is it that you see in a committee that you go, this doesn't feel right, or this is a problem, Mike?
I think one, I've seen this inconsistently, something we should probably harmonize as a practice. Speaking that code universe, when you get to that point of selecting people to go on the screen and maybe go on the finalists, is you just had the interviews, that's all top of mind, and often the voting is exclusive to the interviews. And you're kind of not honoring the whole universe, all the application materials. So I've seen some committees who are really good, like, let's go back and look through the application again on these applicants and combine it with the interview experience, and that kind of informs our final.
So your scenario is to do that, or to not, or something different than that?
To do that, to not forget about the application materials as part of that closed universe and consider.
Yes, yes.
And for me, we have 2 hires, so the committees I've been on in the past, half this cost. It's always a little bit, the committee sort of engages in a little bit of psychoanalysis about how many names we should put forward to try and guarantee our best outcome. We have 2 hires, so that means we should send 3 people, so the president doesn't get as much choice. We should send 5 people, so we don't want to fail. I mean, you laugh, but this kind of stuff goes on. And it's basically, what was that, Herb Rock and the Sun, the big giant head. It just sort of goes up to the big giant head, and we don't really get a lot of clear evidence or guidelines on what's expected.
Okay, so certainly when you have 2 positions, that complicates it, because you could have potentially, if you use the typical 3 to 1, right? For every position, there's 3. You forward 3 people, right? So there's some choice around the president or whatever, right? But if you have 2, so generally speaking, you want to forward. You'd like to first of all, you want to forward people who are meeting your standards around moving them forward, however many that is. Now, you don't want it to be 10 because now you're not screening. You have a responsibility to screen, but you want to forward a sufficient number of people that you've done a fair due diligence of screening that meets your standards for any one of those people get hired, and it would be acceptable for the department because everyone feels like that person is those people that were forwarded, the president could choose and could live with. So if you're asking me for 2, it would probably be ideal that at least 4, maybe 5, are forwarded for 2 positions, ideally speaking. Sometimes it might be 3. 2 is tough because there's not much choice in the 2. And you don't want to forward anyone that's not meeting your standard at the end of the day to meet a number or to do a hire. You'd rather fail a search than live with someone that you have to deal with that's not going to do the job later on, right? And so it's worth going back out again than to live with a lower standard around accepting their employment. So have some discussions with your group. When you talk about 2, it becomes a little bit more, because the pools aren't generally bigger. You're just hiring 2 more people, right? So you may only have 3 or 4 really good candidates, and that's fine. And it's okay to bump up one or two more if really that good if you're talking about filling two positions. But be sure that they are meeting your standard around this will be a great contributor to the organization, period. If you meet that standard, then you'll be fine.
Something that was new to me when I started hiring people that I think was great, but maybe there's some explanation for people who are new on this committee is the role of the leader. Can you just give me
Sure. So in the past, we have provided some additional training around the EO monitor. And in part is, the person isn't in the department and, they have some agency, they feel like they can have some agency without getting in the ways of the throes of the department, that sort of thing. And so we have provided some additional training around that. But that additional training really just got into more of the details of the laws, really. The idea of the monitor is that, A, you have the agency, you feel free to be able to call, on the committee if there's an issue, and that person is the person that would reach out to HR and say, hey, there's an issue. But the chair could do that, and frankly, anybody on the committee can do that. But, there's this title that people feel a little bit more empowered of, hey, I'm the monitor, so and everyone will defer to that person, say, you're the monitor, you kind of decide, contact HR or whatever, or maybe they decide for themselves and that's it. But the point is that all the rules are the same for whether you get the EDO monitor training or not, in terms of the laws and what we're trying to protect against and your ability to say or do something. So the monitor's purpose in part was to not be in the department, so they have the freedom to do that. And secondly, that they can act on when they see something. But you all have had the same training, though, really. And everyone can hold each other accountable to this training, and everyone's heard the same thing today. Everyone's heard the same thing today. So y'all can deliberate that, talk about that, and if someone feels really important that, hey, we need to get HR involved, or you can monitor the discussion and help the discussion along in that, in the meeting, then do so. And if there's an issue, then contact HR.
There's, I don't know if any discussion is happening around this with the EO rep. I know when it was first instituted, there was a question of whether there were a full voting member. And so I don't know if that discussion even happens anymore. I refused to ever go onto a committee where I was not a full voter. I was using the EO rep a few times, but I was like, I'm a full voting member, yes? And they're like, yes. And so, but is there clarification on the institution?
So we as an institution do not remove the vote of the EO monitor. And I've been in institutions where, so for example, in one of my previous ones, the monitor was not a voting member. They were a compliance officer is what they were, and they had no vote. That's not how we practice that here. And I've worked at another district where that wasn't the case either. So EO monitors deemed they are typically on the committee for purposes of the hiring committee, for the purpose of the actually hiring committee, and they also kind of anointed that monitor to help identify someone who people can look at and lean to and say, hey, do you have the agency to say something into the group, and if not, then tell HR something's up. Yes, Michelle.
As far as interviews on Zoom, because previously we've done them, is there any recommendations? Because it seems like it was like a totally different interview. You have a person.
You got the message.
And then there's just the interviews different, they can see us very well. Kind of what's that situation?
Yeah, so I think we're still doing the first levels on Zoom, right? We're still doing first levels on Zoom, and then the second levels are in person.
Any recommendations for for the one I was on? They couldn't see us very well, there's we're around this big table, and, they couldn't see our facial expressions, and, it was just,
Go ahead, sure, no, go ahead.
So I'm not a fan of hybrid interviews or hybrid performance meetings. And so if the candidate is on Zoom, if there is a way for the entire committee to get their laptops and log into the Zoom too, that is the actually most effective and most fair way to conduct that interview, because then you can all see each other, and everyone's in the same playing field in the interview and the questions and things like that. And so it may mean that you need to coordinate as a committee so that everyone has their laptop and can log on and participate in that way, but that's the fairest way to both the committee and the candidate.
We agree too. We would not encourage a hybrid. If you're going to, and we're doing Zoom first level. Everybody is participating singularly on a Zoom.
So what's in the garbage? Big screen, and we were at a big table.
One of the things we were commenting on nursing is we asked them to demonstrate skill. And that is hard when you're doing that on Zoom, like how to give an injection. So then if it's via Zoom, then we're also kind of making the assumption that everybody's gonna have a mannequin to inject into medication, false medication, of course, and syringes, and where to put the syringe, and the Band-Aid, and alcohol. So I guess my question is that, is there any way that, particularly in certain disciplines, when we use these skills, it's a big thing, to do them in person?
Yeah, so we can, yeah, if that is your need, talk to your recruiter, and there may be an exception made for things like that.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Do you feel ready to do a committee? Are we good? Yeah, I mean, you know what to do in case something happens? Right. So wait. That's the second thing you do. That's the second thing you do. The first thing that you do is you talk about it first. The first thing you do is if there's any discrepancies, if there's any bias, if there's anything that someone feels is wrong, talk that through. There may be some assumptions that need to be cleared up, some miscommunication around that. Just be sure that everyone is on the same page around what the issues are. And then if there needs to be an escalation of the issue, then yes, call HR. But that is your thing. Ask the whys, explore, talk about it, and then if there is still something that is just not right that we have to intervene in, then we're here to help. We're here to help.
And I'll emphasize, that's the difference between the unconscious, the implicit, and the intentional, right? So when you're having these conversations and you're exploring what's going on, you can usually address and resolve the unconscious and the implicit. The intentional, I'm never putting my vote for that person, I'm never gonna support that person, I'm disregarding everything that is relevant to this candidate because I've already made up my mind and I'm not gonna consider anything else, the intentional always needs to be escalated. Sometimes the unconscious can't get resolved, but in most instances it can, but the intentional, that's gonna be a problem and you need to escalate that.
So they were talking about associates who are applying to the pool. From what I heard from previous annual committees, is that if they make it to the top 10, that they automatically have to send them for an interview.
Yeah, so that's an agreement that we have with the associate faculty. That's within the inclusion of them to be sure that they're part of the process. We do that. So yes, that we do that.
Obviously, didn't happen at Maricosta because Maricosta would never do this. But if in the process of you interviewing, you do see that someone is blatantly like falling asleep or, just yawning or being disruptive, meaning the committee, what do you do? Do you stop the interview? Do you reschedule the interview? Like, how do we do it so that, because that specific applicant is getting not the equal treatment, right? So what do we do in that case, besides obviously calling HR and talking to the person?
Well, you might need to call HR. You can pause the interview for a moment if it's and have a side conversation away from the candidate. Say, we have something we got to address. Just give us a moment. Excuse the candidate just for a little bit. And if someone is really being disruptive and I actually have seen that happen.
It happened in my interview. That's what I'm asking.
Okay. Yes. Yes, I have actually, no, I too, I have seen that happen, and it did happen to me once before as well. Not here. But I also have had that experience too. And as a candidate, if you see someone falling asleep and someone notices it, and they say, we're going to take a pause here, you should feel good about it that as a candidate that they're taking actions and measures to deal with something that you recognize yourself as being rude and unprofessional, right? And and it could mess up your candidacy. Like I'm here to get a job. This dude's sleeping, right? I mean, no, that's not okay. And so, yes, it's, if someone is really tired and they just shouldn't be there, then you can have that conversation and disrupt that, because that's not fair to the candidate. It's not how we want to represent ourselves. And intervention is necessary. You don't, in something like that, okay, I will tell you, as HR, we definitely want to know about that. And we want to know that a committee suspended and that kind of thing, but if you've handled it, then that's fine. And the committee member that's doing it, maybe they corrected and they went and got some water and they took a little walk and now they feel better, whatever. But if there's a need to hold a committee and you have the grounds to do it, do it. If you have the grounds to suspend a committee because something is wrong, a follow-up question, oh yeah, tell me how old you are. Hold that committee. Stop. It's okay to pause the committee and regroup. We don't want to see people taking notes that are something or whatever. You see someone that they're talking about, they're making notes of stuff, a protected class, like that's not what we do. We do not want to toss out that recruitment. We don't want to do that. So if you see something that's not right, you definitely have that responsibility. You have to do something in the interest of the candidate and the institution.
Yeah, MTA motto, if you see something, say something, right? Just keep it in your mind, because ultimately, you're doing the candidate and yourselves a disservice if you go through that entire interview without addressing the issue.
And so because first level interviews are on Zoom, is the assumption then that it's then required that everybody has their camera on?
So I would really have a problem if people aren't having their cameras on during an interview. That's really, to me, that's problematic. I hope no one is doing that. I mean, I feel like that shouldn't have to even be said, right? That you would not have your camera on for an interview. So.
Well, you're going to consider that. So the question over here in the chatter was, what if the candidate doesn't have their camera on, right? Like, that's going to be considered as we relate to that candidate in the same way it would be problematic for you.
What else? Anything else that can come up in the interview, the process, the applications, anything else? We want you leaving here today feeling confident about what you're about to do. Any other outstanding questions? So what's the first thing you do? Talk about it. And then if it needs to be escalated, call HR. That's it. That's it. Okay. Very good. I think is lunch